Hey, it's Sarah. I hope you're doing great. Today I want to talk to you about the basics of bilingual speech therapy evaluation. Now, I have been a bilingual speech pathologist. I'm coming to the end of my 13th year, so I've done this for a long time, and I've always worked with bilingual kids, specifically Spanish, English speakers. Now, when I am coming to evaluate a student, whether it's a student that I already have on my caseload or it's a new student to me, I am looking for communication skills. So that is what I'm evaluating. Now, when you think about speech therapy, I actually wear a lot of hats, and that means that I'm going to be looking at speech sounds, their language skills, and their vocab. And when I'm doing a bilingual evaluation, I'm looking for the presence of these skills in any language. Typically, my caseload consists of half is about pretty much monolingual Spanish speakers who don't speak any English. And the other half are kids who are bilingual and are speaking Spanish and English, but both are poorly developed. And that's how you know there's a communication issue. So, for example, let's just throw out a bunch of different scenarios. If I get a referral and the teacher says the student doesn't speak English, but the student can't communicate in Spanish, I'll do an evaluation, and typically what that may show is they don't have the communication skills. So for example, let's say one of the things is following directions, and I use the words arriba y abajo, which are up and down. So can the kid understand up and down? And if the kid cannot understand up and down, arriba y abajo in Spanish, and they don't have any English, I know that there's a deficit there. Now, when I'm looking at another student, for example, that is speaking both English and Spanish, I'm going to assess that student, and I'm going to look for the presence of a skill. Let's say arriba y abajo otra vez again. Are they able to, understand up and down? I'll say it up and down. I'll say it arriba y abajo. Have them, and what I need to see is that they lack the understanding of that and the expression in both languages. So I'm looking at both their receptive, that's what we call it, receptive language, what they're taking in, and then what they're expressing. So if they're lacking the ability to understand that skill and express it, that's a concern depending on their age, of course. But so that's what I need to see to be able to give the label of speech language disordered, is typically what it's referred to during an eligibility meeting. I don't want to give the label of speech language disordered to a child that can speak well. Obviously, that would be pretty sad if I did that. So that's why when I look at their language skills, and when I refer to language, I'm not referring to the language they speak. I'm referring to grammar, syntax, comprehension, all those things. I want to see that those are present in whether it's Spanish or English. I need to see that it's present. So sometimes I've gotten, for example, a referral for a student that is in an English classroom and is not doing well. And so they don't speak English well, and they're not doing well academically. And so I'm brought in to assess in Spanish to tell them whether or not the student has a communication problem. And so when I do actually it's quite a lengthy battery of testing in Spanish to see whether they can communicate. And there have been many times that I've given that assessment and found that the kid has great Spanish. In fact, their Spanish is great, and intact is typically how I'd refer to them. So they'd have like intact Spanish, and then maybe their English skills aren't, there yet. That's when I would make a recommendation that there's no speech therapy concern. The student can communicate great in Spanish. They just haven't learned English. So like if you think about it with 2 columns with a bilingual student, there's 2 columns, one for each language, and you would say that those skills are there in Spanish, they're absent in English. And that would be called a language difference. It would not be a disorder, and that would be a real travesty to label that child as speech and language disordered when they're just learning English. So those are make up a percentage of my referrals. And I should go back and say that one thing I actually do with my schedule, I reserve one day where I do bilingual speech therapy evaluations around like the Chicago suburbs. So that's something I do. I have some relationships with some districts where they bring me in to only do the Spanish testing, and that is kind of how things have been for me for many years. They don't need me to do the English testings. That their building speech pathologist who's monolingual will do the English testing, and they want to have ownership over that kind of information because they've potentially been working with the student in English and they want to know their functioning. Now, the one thing is I'll come in and I'll do an assessment in Spanish and I'll be able to tell them, you know, a lot of different things. Essentially, either they're in the average range or they're not. So one thing I have seen in another kind of referrals is that I get are kids that don't speak Spanish. So I'll get a referral from somebody that says my student was, I assessed my student in English, or I've gotten a new referral and the English is not good. And I'd want to know if they're okay in Spanish. So I'll come in and I'll test a student. There have been many times where kids say, they don't know what I'm saying in Spanish, or I've had kids say something like, that's what grandma talks, that kind of thing. And I'll do an assessment and there's very minimal Spanish knowledge. And of course, then you can say, those skills are absent in Spanish and to some degree absent in English. And those kids definitely need speech therapy, and they need speech therapy in English. That's because that is the language the child is communicating in. And as a speech pathologist, I keep in mind that's the whole thing that I do is communication. So I value the language the child uses to communicate. So for my students that are Spanish dominant, and like I said, that's 50% on my caseload, I work in Spanish with them. I don't speak English to them. I want them to get those communication skills in the language they use so that they can be very good communicators in the language that they use. Now, what do I do in therapy with students that have, for example, like I said, poorly developed English, poorly developed Spanish, they struggle with communication? I typically do speak both languages to them. So it depends on the child. Like, I don't want to make a blanket statement because there are, there's so many different kids in this world and they present very differently, and we have to look at them on a very individual basis. So I acknowledge how they communicate to me, and that is, very important for the child. I recently did an evaluation where the student was receiving speech therapy in English because they're in a school where there's no bilingual speech pathologist. And the student is most definitely Spanish dominant. But the evaluation was for me to determine how good the student was at Spanish, and surprisingly, the student was excellent. But what was interesting was part of the goal of this evaluation was to see how much progress the student had made on their goals to use longer and more complex utterances. And the intervention was provided in English. And I did an assessment in Spanish. And one thing that came out in the assessment was the students' utterances were really great. They were so complex and detailed. The verbs were really good, and the grammatical terms were great, on target. The research says that this intervention that's provided is really, like I said, going back to the beginning, It's all about communication. It's the language is less important. Just to wrap up, the basics of a bilingual evaluation really are about communication. I'm not trying to teach anybody English. I'm not trying to teach anybody Spanish. I'm trying to get the student to communicate more. And that's exactly what I evaluate when I look at kids. So if you have any questions, I'd love it if you leave a comment below. Please like this video and subscribe, because I just love sharing information with you, and I will catch you another time. Bye.
Really fine to give. It's okay.